Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Stuart Campo, and I'm the team lead for data responsibility at the OCHA Center for Humanitarian Data, based in the Netherlands. And it's my pleasure to be hosting this session today on data ethics and responsibility in humanitarian action, where we hope to share some lessons that will be relevant for the early warning, early action community as part of your ongoing workshop. Perhaps I will start again with the note from our technical moderator in case my initial introduction was cut off. So briefly to recap, my name is Stuart Campo and I'm the team lead for data responsibility at the OCHA Center for Humanitarian Data. I am joined today by two experts in humanitarian data ethics and tech more broadly, who I'll introduce momentarily. And we're here to deliver what really will be a dialogue about what we've learned as humanitarians about data ethics in a way that we hope will be relevant for you all as the early warning, early action community in the context of your ongoing workshop. So hopefully you can see all three of us on the screen. And I'll start with some introductions before we dive right in. Just as a process note, feel free to drop questions or comments into, I believe you have a separate system, but your chat, and we will be able to see those throughout the course of the discussion. We have some dedicated time at the end of the session for Q&A with the audience, but feel free to share your questions throughout, and we'll try to address as many of them as possible. So joining me today are Linnet Taylor and Nathaniel Raymond. Linnet is an associate professor at the Tilburg Institute for Law, Technology, and Society, also known as TILT, which is based here in the Netherlands. And her research focuses on digital data, representation, and democracy with a particular attention to transnational governance issues. She's also been doing extensive research over the past several years in the humanitarian sector, and we've had the chance to benefit from her insights as a data ethicist in the context of some of the thorny dilemmas that we face as humanitarians. Nathaniel Raymond, who I will say now I'll likely refer to as Natty. This is an agreed short form, so I'm not being rude, but good, Natty, if we can do that. Natty is a lecturer at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale University in New Haven in the United States. And his research has really focused on human rights and human security implications of ICTs for vulnerable populations, particularly in humanitarian crises over the past more than a decade, about 15 years now. Natty was previously the founding director of the Signal Program on Human Security and Technology at Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, which is at the HSPH School at Harvard, and was also the director of operations for a project that preceded Signal, which you'll hear about more momentarily. So the idea today is that we'll start with discussing a few concrete ethical dilemmas that have arisen in humanitarian data and tech work. We'll unpack those a bit to help understand how, as humanitarians, we approach these types of issues, and then we'll zoom out a bit more to the kind of practice and semantics of this discussion of humanitarian data ethics. So keep your questions coming, and we hope you enjoy the discussion. With that, Linnet, I'd like to turn first to you and just invite you to share one example of an ethical dilemma that you've been engaging with or studying through your recent research in the humanitarian field. So over to you, Linnet.
Thanks very much, Stuart, and thanks for having me on this panel. So one of the most prominent kind of dilemmas that has come up over the last few years is one that happens when private sector actors intersect with humanitarian actors. And this is obviously an increasingly common phenomenon. It happens in a bunch of different ways, many of them beneficial. But the dilemma I'd like to bring to the group today is one where, is a type of dilemma where we see a private sector actor which has a declared interest in the security or geopolitical interests of a particular humanitarian donor country or donor government. So it is flying the flag for a particular country and a particular ideology. And in relation to that, it's been involved in human rights abuses elsewhere than the collaboration it's proposing. When this actor then proposes to a humanitarian organization that they do something together which seems neutral, and where it promises there will be no privacy implications, there are no civil rights implications, that it will comply with the humanitarian mission, and that it's genuinely interested in the humanitarian mission in this context. However, we know that with technology firms in particular, we should look a little beyond the issue of privacy and civil rights compliance, which they tend to bring to the table at the initial conversation, and think about issues such as what models and knowledge will they get out of a collaboration that they might be able to use in other contexts? Do we think that the populations that we are exposing them to, that our affected groups, will enable them to act on similar groups in the world and under other circumstances or later on? And do we know whether what they gain from this engagement will be used by governmental actors elsewhere in the world who may not have the interests of these affected people in mind? So that's the dilemma I'd like to present.
Excellent, Linnet. Thanks for that. And I should have clarified for the audience that basically what we'll do is put the two dilemmas on the table and then work through them together with you. So I have a lot of follow-up questions for Linnet, but for now we'll leave it there and turn to Natty to hear about his dilemma, and then we'll dive a bit deeper. So Natty, over to you.
Okay, quick question here for our technical support. Can I share screen for a second? Let's see, there we go. Okay, so let's go back in time. It's 2011, the late summer, early fall of 2011, and South Sudan has just seceded from Sudan. And as Stuart mentioned, I was directing operations for the Satellite Sentinel project, which was funded and founded by George Clooney. You may have heard of him, Doug Ross from the popular TV show ER. So we were at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative using high resolution satellite imagery and information from the ground in the largest civilian deployment ever of high resolution satellite imagery to conduct early warning of attacks on civilians. This image is what we were looking at in early September. And what it is, and let's zoom in here. If you look on the road, this is about a battalion to a brigade-sized force of Sudan armed forces moving south from a town called Ad Damazin, moving towards a rebel stronghold controlled at that point by Sudan People's Liberation Army North, which you'll hear me call SPLA-N. And the town was called Kermuk. And Kermuk was basically the headquarters of the Blue Nile contingent of SPLA-N. The Sudan Armed Forces, by this point in 2011, had invaded a contested region called Abyei, and they had also conducted house-to-house killing and large-scale massacres with mass graves in the town of Kadugli of Nuba people. And we had been warning and monitoring both incidents. Now it looked like they were going to open up a third front in the fight in Blue Nile against the Ingasana people. And so we were able to get a jump on the Sudan Armed Forces movement south. Now, the difficult situation here is that it wasn't just folks on the road. Air capacity was coming in hard behind the ground forces. Here you're seeing Mi-24 helicopter gunships, which were designed to fire at tanks, but in African conflict are often used to fire at civilians and irregular infantry. And then that big plane, Antonov AN-2426 transport plane, but often used by Sudan Armed Forces for indiscriminate bombardment on civilian communities. There was another thing going on that we used infrared to detect T-54, T-55 tanks and ground vehicles, including armored personnel carriers and trucks that were covered in camouflage, basically branches that were strapped to the corners of the vehicles to make it harder for folks from the ground to spot. But most notably, we think it was to try to avoid us. And so using near infrared, we were able to pop those vehicles that you see with the little arrows out from where they were hiding off road. Now we had to make an educated assessment of where they were attacking. Southward movement towards Kermuk. In that town, we knew there was thousands of civilians. And so we had a very hard decision. Do we tell them publicly that SAF is coming? And now let's break this down, and we'll do more about this in a second. What responsibility do we have to know that we are right? How certain do we have to be? Second, what's our responsibility to prepare or ensure assistance is prepared for those on the run? Third, what happens if we're wrong and we're leading them into a trap? And fourth, what happens if we're right, but I call this catastrophic success, and we cause the calculation of the Sudan Armed Forces to change? That's what we're going to talk about more. This is a real life example. It happened. I had to make the call, and we'll discuss it in a little bit.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for setting that up, Natty. And I do hope people were able to see those images because it really contextualizes the scenario that Natty and his team were navigating. It's really helpful, I think, the aperture and also type of dilemmas that Linnet and Natty have put on the table, because they're clearly quite distinct, but increasingly in the humanitarian space and likely also in the early warning space, this intersection of multiple different types of actors that Linnet alluded to, and then the particular data type or types and decisions that Natty mentioned are coming together. There are increasingly more private sector actors or technology firms particularly being involved in and offering their services to support the type of analytics and fast-paced decision-making that you'll hear more about from Natty's example. So this is relevant, hopefully, to a lot of the work that everyone in the audience is doing, and helps us understand that it's very difficult to isolate a single dilemma in the real world, and frankly, even in the abstract. So that's what we're trying to unpack in this discussion. So Linnet, to come back to the dilemma you presented to the group, you mentioned some of the key considerations already, and also characterized some of those as things that perhaps the private actor wasn't focusing on necessarily, or might not be focusing on in their own assessment of sort of what they needed to commit to proceed with this collaboration. But could you help us understand a bit more, either from the perspective of the humanitarian actor or just in the context of the dilemma, what are the key factors at play here in terms of what needs to be deliberated and balanced? You alluded to those factors earlier, but can we go a bit deeper on some of the considerations that you mentioned, just so that people understand what's really being balanced here in terms of the consequences at hand?
Sure. So I'm sure there are more factors that I'm going to name right now, and I would welcome input on those from either of you. But some of the big ones seem to be publicity. In a world where humanitarian actors are rapidly getting, if not defunded, then less funded, and where there is some very real competition between actors for not only donor funds, but for proving that they are nimble, efficient, and competent. And this has very real impacts on their ability to carry out their missions. So one, I think, quite valid issue in play there is who can perform being the best organization. And one way of doing that is engaging with high-profile technology actors from the private sector who bring you certain credibility in terms of efficiency, anti-fraud mechanisms particularly, and on increasing the visibility of process. So that's one thing that's in play. Another thing is just the ability to carry out your mission as an organization. If you are offered a tool which you think will enable you to reach more people better and to experience potentially less fraud or more efficient logistics, maybe you feel that it's your responsibility to take that offer and to try to deal with the downside as best you can. I would say, yeah, probably the third thing is the desire to practice engaging with technology firms, which is increasingly a skill that humanitarian actors need to have, and there's a lot of pressure, aside from political pressure to perform efficiency and the pressure to actually accomplish the mission. There's also simply a pressure to be innovative and to engage with the modern world as they see it, as we see it, and to develop competences. So there's sort of the mission-related drive, there's the publicity-related drive, and there's the competence-related drive. And on the other side, what counterweighted that, obviously, is the potential for very bad publicity and for getting co-opted into activities that you're not willing to be co-opted into. And also, there are some known unknowns, which I mentioned when I laid out the dilemma, which involve trying to understand what the derivatives of this engagement might be and what comes out of it that might be financially or operationally useful to the firm that you're engaging with. And just the invisibility, the opaqueness of that is also an issue that organizations have to deal with. How can you balance the opacity of this engagement with the necessity of the engagement? So I think those are the major lines of division there.
Brilliant, and that hits the key points that came to mind hearing that dilemma, Linnet. So thank you. I think that's a really clear summary on both sides of what would be weighed. And we'll come a bit later in the discussion to some of the tactics that humanitarians are trying to use to anticipate those impacts. I think particularly the last point you were making is something that we really struggle with, because the potential future uses of derivative analytics, insight, or training of models, or whatever the various outputs might be, are very difficult to fully assess. We lack evidence in this space, particularly on the negative externalities of this type of work, but frankly, also the positive side. The benefits are anecdotally understood, but not particularly well evidenced. So that makes it really difficult to make a cool-headed assessment. I think cases like Nathaniel's, and we'll come back to that now, are not representative of the level of evidence that exists. The depth of the report that you just saw on Nathaniel's screen is unfortunately not characteristic of how we have documented cases as a sector, and we need more of that. So hopefully that's also something that this type of discussion can motivate people to invest more in at the institutional level. But I imagine people are eager to hear what happened and whether catastrophic success bore out, Natty. So back over to you.
Well, so it was in September that we saw the drive beginning. And we thought this was, and just let me give you some spatial facts here, that basically at Damazin, where the SAF forces, Sudan Armed Forces, were launching from, was about 400 miles north of Kermuk. Now, you've got to remember, this is Sudan. And while it was the dry season then, it was just the very end of the wet. And so basically, while the roads were passable, the roads were not super highways. And 400 miles in Sudan can be, without fighting your way there, can be a matter of days, even in the best conditions. And what you couldn't see from the satellite imagery is that the SPLAN had set up a series of ambush points, and we couldn't see that. So as I say all the time, you've got to, as I give you the TikTok here, new ways of seeing create new ways of being blind. While we can see the big tanks, we can't see what was affecting the calculus of the big tanks, which was tiny guys hiding in the bushes. And what was happening is that that big ground drive you saw turned right. And we thought they were in a beeline. And it turns out that they actually, spoiler alert, they went towards another base of the SPLAN that we couldn't see at Dindiro Mountain. It sounds like something out of Lord of the Rings, but they took a right and they basically went over to Dindiro Mountain and engaged in a battle that lasted weeks. And it would be one of probably the last large battle ever done at this scale by the SAF. And we were seeing pieces of it, and we were having to engage in a probabilistic assessment about the human security threat without having the whole picture. And our main enemy in this was not only time and not people with guns, it was clouds. And the biggest problem is that there was high cloud cover. And so we were seeing through this peephole, through the door here, snapshots that we had to put together. And what we were stitching together, and we were building the methodology, we were building the airplane as we were flying it, we had to make sure, I'm going to give you a fancy term here, it's called dispositivity. Dispositivity is when the answer presented to you is the answer with no other reasonable alternative. And so in criminal cases, they'll say this evidence is dispositive of murder. You like to think, because you have things like satellite imagery and ones and zeros and feature extraction, that it's dispositive. It is not dispositive. It is highly not dispositive. And so what we were worried about is that there was a flanking motion south of the mountain from another group of forces that we couldn't see. And that if we got the direction wrong on where the civilians would go from Kurmuk, they would walk into them. That was problem one. The other problem is that they would get across the border into Ethiopia and we would, and there would be no one there to assist them. And so what we thought was a technical problem, a early warning problem, was actually a humanitarian operations problem. Who do we call to tell within the United Nations that we're about to say, 5-alarm fire, ring, ring, ring. We are going to issue this alert and say, Kurmuk, run. And so we called UNMISS, UN Mission in Sudan. We call them single S.
Natty, your connection is breaking up a little bit for me. I'm not sure, Linnet. Now it looks like you're back now. Yeah, we lost you at UNMISS when you were starting to explain single S.
So we called the UN mission in Sudan, we call it single S as opposed to UN mission in South Sudan, where I would later work as a consultant on early warning. And basically we advised them that we were likely going to cause a population displacement. And so we issued the alert, and within about 36 to 48 hours, we had reports that civilians were walking across the line. Later, we would see evidence of them in motion. And so we had triggered a population displacement with our warning. And additionally, we had triggered some other things. The SPLAN then claimed that there was a rocket attack on a Save the Children compound in Kurmuk, and that they said Satellite Sentinel had saved lives by getting people out of Kurmuk. Well, that's great, hooray for us, but problem is Save the Children did not have an office in Kurmuk. They had a storage closet, and there appears to have been no rocket attack or aerial attack. Suddenly our warning becomes part of an active conflict between SPLAN, and we've now released active intelligence available to both parties. We have caused a civilian displacement, and we have provided propaganda fodder for a non-state armed actor who is involving an NGO as a key part of their propaganda narrative, which has clearly no evidence that it's true to support it. And so that was our, we went into this saying, oh, we're going to save this town. When you do warning, regardless of what technology or any technology you use, don't think about, is the smoke alarm going off? Think about what happens 1 hour, 2 hours out from the smoke alarm going off in terms of evacuating that building. What's your actual order of operations? We have focused so much on, did the button on the dashboard turn red? Did the light turn red? And yay, that's success. No, it's not. And in many cases, that's actually failure. For civilians on the ground, you have to get, in their view, what's their calculus? And what is their actual option set in terms of where do they go? What do they do? You can know your warning, and you can be down to the ground in terms of the facts. And usually you're not, but let's say you are. You can't take to the bank what a large group of people, highly vulnerable people, who are often hearing this third hand, are going to do with the information you deploy into that environment. Over.
Thanks for that additional sort of part of the story, Natty. I think it really helps people understand what's at stake in what might seem like a remote analytical operation, but actually has so many different implications on the ground. And I think in some ways, this connects back to some of the points that Linnet was flagging in terms of the externalities and the knock-on effects. You know, whether that's a private company having access to intelligence and training data that might allow them to understand and engage in different ways, positive or negative, with a certain population, or intelligence and analysis being used, misused, abused by different actors for whom it's not originally intended. Ultimately, this is a matter of understanding what those unintended consequences might be and being able to reasonably mitigate them while also not missing the chance to use the data and the insight from that data to help save lives or help mitigate the impacts of a shock. And that's, in terms of the ethical assessment, but also the practical work, that's really arguably the most challenging piece. So I imagine people in the audience are curious to understand sort of how can you do this well? And either in the context of the dilemmas you shared, or maybe abstracting a bit out, I'd like to shift our attention to that, sort of the process of deliberation. And you both touched a bit on the different issues and how the different actors in your dilemmas might think through them. But let's think practically from the perspective of a practitioner. How am I actually thinking about these issues, unpacking them, articulating them, or am I doing that at all? We know, as Hugo Slim reminds us on a regular basis, that we're great as a sector at articulating principles, but not particularly strong at actually deliberating them or understanding what they mean in practical day-to-day work. So how do we get to that kind of deliberative process? What might it look like in the different sort of stakeholder groups that you were referring to in your respective dilemmas? And moving forward, how can that be improved? You know, what would a better version of this story look like in, you know, we're 10 years on from this example that you've just shared, Natty. So we'll go first to Linnet, but then thinking in almost in that lens, you know, what would you do differently? And you've done quite a lot in the intervening period from what you learned from that particular case. And I think Linnet, given that it's an abstracted but very real dilemma, unfortunately, it's a scenario that many humanitarian organizations find themselves in. Feel free to speak, you know, more generally to how these types of actors could think about the deliberative process, or specifically to some of the examples you've been studying. So back over to you, Linnet.
Thanks. So this is a tough one because it takes in a bunch of different dilemmas at different levels. Actually, the main hidden factor here is really geopolitics. It's not even that hidden, I think, if you're the organization, but for people from outside trying to analyze this, the geopolitics is the last thing that you find out about with any degree of specificity. So what's interesting there is the amount of pressure that organizations are under to engage with particular actors or particular types of actor from the private sector. And having done some research on this for a while now, I really see that that pressure is becoming more extreme every day. Having said that, I think that there's a case for, and Natty can probably speak to this too, for thinking a little differently in the case of technology partnerships about how the population you're trying to serve relates to your mission overall, how your ability to serve the population in front of you relates to your mission overall, I guess. So it goes beyond treat the patient in front of you, you know, to go back to medical ethics, without any prejudice, right? Treat the enemy the same as you know, cure the enemy if he is in front of you or injured. to thinking about who are the patients elsewhere, right? Who are you not treating, or who are you causing problems for by treating the patient in front of you in this particular way? What are your options? And because of the geopolitics, these options can become very complicated and very hard to decide between. What we see in this situation from most organizations is they retreat into emphasizing privacy in a classic sort of data protection-esque kind of way. They retreat into compliance with standards which are more principles for the humanitarian sector than law. So we sort of retreat into soft law, basically, and retreat also into efficiency and cost saving, and make a case that this serves the patient in front of the organization at a much reduced cost, and therefore enables the organization to do its job better overall. That is usually the justification that we see in these cases, and there are now, as you say, an awful lot of these cases, and they manifest differently at every time. But really, there's always sort of a privacy flavor to the response, and there's always an efficiency flavor to the response. And I think the question that this draws for us into the picture is, how do we ascertain whether something has overall protective effects? And this is something that I know is very big in the landscape for Natty as well. How do you ascertain what overall protective effects look like? How do you take a consequentialist view where you say, this will be good for this population that I can name and see in front of me, and therefore it's important to do it? Or do you take more of a basic sort of deontologist frame and say, it's probably a good / a bad idea to engage with this actor for this purpose? And you look at the entirety of their actions across the board of their activities. It sounds as if I'm very neutral on this. I'm really not, because I think that incrementally the humanitarian mission gets chipped away at through these kinds of engagements. And eventually the standards change and people become, sort of everything shifts politically, and people become very ready to see things as neutral that would not have been seen as neutral before. So people's resistance gets worn down. And I think that's really problematic, because there will always be pressure on the humanitarian community to cut costs and to behave in the interests of donors rather than affected populations. There always has been, and there always will be. And I think we're seeing particularly sort of digital technologies chip away much more efficiently at that core moral sensibility than other more obvious sort of baseball bats that have assaulted the humanitarian community in the past. I think that it's very tempting to ignore the people you can't see. And I think the incentives to do that are very, very high. So I have a lot of sympathy for organizations that do engage with, shall we just say, sort of dodgy or potentially dodgy partners. But I think there's a broader community argument to discuss this more openly, to discuss the politics of this more openly, and to formulate standards and principles that deal with this. And I think that that's coming slowly, but it's very hard to discuss because there's a lot of geopolitics in the mix. And there's a lot of life or death financial issues in the mix as well. And with that, I'll pass over to Natty.
Thanks, Linnet. There's a lot to unpack there, and we will come back to a few of those points. But I want to make one connection, which I imagine Natty will be happy to speak about, to the protective effect that you mentioned, because I think one complicating factor for humanitarians is the perceived value and the perceived impact of these different data methodologies and technologies. And it's not a malicious misinterpretation, it's a belief, because this is the narrative that we've developed as a sector. We have availability of this story. We don't have evidence of harm. We don't have much to look to in terms of when things go wrong, and that makes it difficult to shift our focus away from that narrative of a positive protective effect. But Natty's written about the ambient protective effect in the context of work similar to what he shared. So Natty, I'm curious to hear, either in the context of the Kermuk example or just more broadly, what you think about some of what Linnet just shared in terms of how we're thinking about these issues as humanitarians, but then also how can we get beyond that kind of ascribed positive protective value of technology to really understand what's at stake?
So I'm replaying what Linnet just said, like it's a text on a page in front of me, and I've got my yellow highlighter out, and I'm highlighting in Linnet's text the part about the way technology can erode the humanitarian principles significantly more effectively and insidiously than the baseball bats of, say, military and intelligence encroachment into humanitarian response. Highlighted, underlined in ballpoint pen, exclamation, stars, and hearts. Yes, and the there would be a story of transformation into science fiction level capabilities. And that was based on a theory of change that believed in what you mentioned, that Kristen Sandvik and I call the ambient protective effect, that more information, more data equates with better response. The more we know about a situation, the safer the people in danger are. And we believe that deeply. And we have little to no evidence for it. And we actually have no theory of evaluating that evidence. And we have large amounts of counterfactual evidence. But still we persist on and on, like homeopathic medicine. And this idea that we can use tinctures of algorithms or throw in some nightshade and some feature extraction. And having look at the example, and let me just share the screen to put a fine point on it. Look at this. So we've talked about, and Linnet said it very well, that the people who are affected are not seen as part of these decisions. Okay, here are the people we were talking about in the example of Kermuk. This is the Shirkale camp in Ethiopia. This is where many of them went. These are UNHCR family tents. That's what we contributed to. And those are the people. And so these, for us as organizations, as operators, we are thinking in terms of a political economy of, as data brokers, that brokering this data with other companies. In this case, we were working with literally a defense contractor, then Digital Globe, now Maxar, whose largest customer is the United States government, that there was this political economy of data brokerage where we're all thinking about what we get for our organizations. And things that we would do in Africa could win us a Nobel Peace Prize, but could get us arrested in the United States. And the fact of the matter is that real people are being affected by that disaster experimentation. So how has my practice changed since then? This experience, not only this incident, but other incidents as part of Sentinel, this changed the entire direction of my life. I went from this idea of trying to cause an ambient protective effect to later, when I was consulting for UN mission in South Sudan, my theory of change had, excuse the statement, had changed. And I realized that the best thing to do was to capture these insights privately, discreetly, and use that information behind the scenes to motivate action. Injecting it out into the world for reasons of getting media attention, getting funding, was actually degrading the human security of the people we were trying to help. That at the end of the day, we still continue to do this. Just you don't see it anymore. And it has gone under the hood. And these types of methods are used all the time by multiple humanitarian agencies. This went from science fiction to standard procedure. And it is now less and less about the bright, shiny object. And it's more and more about integration into decision support frameworks. And it's in those decision support frameworks that ethics happens. And so what I want to leave you with, and I will shut up here, is that it's about the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle is that new scientific processes and products should not be injected into ecosystems without sufficient evidence about what they will do. And that is the key for us to live our primary humanitarian principle, which is the principle of humanity. Over.
Thank you for that, Natty, and thanks for drawing this image back up on the screen. Just so you know, we can still see it. There we go. Perfect. I think, just as a reminder to the audience, we got about 20 minutes left, and we welcome your questions. But I think what's helpful here is the convergence around kind of what we believe to be true versus what we know to be true, and how that affects the way we assess the ethical implications of different types of partnerships, different types of technologies, different types of analytical models with data, and their use in complex humanitarian peace settings. So I'm curious, Linnet, you mentioned the kind of, well, you didn't say it was disproportionate. I would say it's disproportionate so far, but this heavy focus on data protection and a data protection lens that a lot of organizations are falling back on for good reason, certainly, but that direct us away from other issues that you've written extensively about, including group privacy. And I think taking the group, particularly given the audience that we have here today and the types of issues they're worrying about in terms of early warning and early action, that's a helpful foil to the personal data protection lens that is the, frankly, predominant lens through which we talk about these issues. And often when we say ethics, when we're talking about data, we mean data protection. That tends to often be almost interchangeable semantically. So I'm interested whether you're seeing people start to engage more thoughtfully with the beyond personal data dimensions, and also from a language perspective, and maybe relatedly a conceptual perspective, how are humanitarians actually talking about the ethical issues, or is it kind of interchangeable with legal or regulatory concepts like data protection? Because I certainly feel a frustration there that everyone is saying ethics, and there are dozens of sets of ethical principles for AI particularly, but other areas of data and technology in the sector as well, but saying it doesn't make it so. So how are they saying it, and what issues are they really looking at beyond that personal data protection dimension?
So you give this a really helpful framing. I also have noticed that what gets referenced as ethics in relation to humanitarian technology is often compliance with not particularly applicable data protection rules and standards from national jurisdictional contexts. And because international law is in play rather than country law, what happens is that those standards and rules become referred to as ethics. And then we get a similar transformation that we see in the corporate world, where they like to translate data protection compliance into ethics because it feels like soft law then. That for humanitarians, it actually does become ethics. But then it winds up strangely displacing the actual ethics of humanitarian action, which is what belongs front and center. And if we don't have those ethics in play, which is actual ethics, then it doesn't really matter if we're doing data protection compliance, right? I mean, it's really nice to have data protection compliance, but if people are dying, that's not the question that they're asking necessarily. And this is what we all tried to get at in our work on the group privacy concept, Natty included. Natty's idea of demographically identifiable data is the most relevant and powerful for the humanitarian community, I think. But we had a bunch of different contributors in that volume that tried to think through the legitimacy of intervention broadly. This is where it goes. It doesn't go to privacy in the end. It becomes about the legitimacy of intervention, which is actually about a humanitarian ethics more broadly. So I guess what I've seen over the time that I've been studying this, which is about a decade now, is this shift from a pure focus on humanitarian innovation as something fresh and exciting and potentially the savior of a sector that's been having a bit of a tough time financially, and in terms of political support as well, as we know. So tech as the savior and tech as politically neutral and mission neutral in some way, which is how you've been describing it, I think, both of you, to a group of people happily getting larger every day who focus on tech as profoundly political and who are looking for governance and ethical innovation to try to realign what is going on in the real world with the humanitarian mission, which is front and center for everybody doing this work. And yet somehow the tech pushes it out, as Nadia and I have both been saying, incrementally and invisibly. So I see this real struggle now between groups that are focusing on the neutral character of tech and folks who are really looking at governing tech the same way that you govern any other intervention in the humanitarian sphere. And I think in the end, the governance group is going to win because it is so manifestly obvious that this needs to be governed, just like anything else. So that's my take on it.
I think that aligns with a lot of what we're certainly living in the sector and also hearing in these debates. It brings to mind for me one dimension, which Nadia, I'll come to you in a minute to reflect on, which is maybe the opposite of a Venn diagram where the middle is empty, and that is a competency in how humanitarian issues and ethics and technological capability and how to bring those two together sits, because a lot of the engagement of the humanitarian sector with private sector, particularly technology firms, has been deferential over the years. We as humanitarians feel we don't have the expertise to question how the tools are built or deployed. That has changed, and certainly humanitarians have cut their teeth in terms of the technical expertise, but there's a gap in competence there. And on the other side, there's a gap, let's not say it's willful, though in some cases it feels that way, but a gap in understanding how humanitarianism works or should work, and the principles that drive what we do. And so there's a lack of competence, or maybe an incompetence to a certain degree, in how to navigate these issues. And it brings to mind, this famous quote about well-intentioned but incompetent people being potentially much more risky than poorly or ill-intentioned competent people, because the competent people at least have qualms about what they're doing. And if you're not aware, as Nadia, you often say, if you don't know the harm, you can't mitigate or prevent the harm. So if people aren't able to actually understand the full picture, and if that competency is lacking, we're in a very difficult position. And so it could either be do nothing, but that's really not a viable option, particularly for those in the audience. So how do we get at this competency gap or issue? How do we navigate that? And then maybe more broadly, how do we think about building toward a more professional, you talk a lot about professionalization, a more professional onboarding or adoption of some of these technologies and the data that they generate?
There's 4 quadrants that are beginning to happen and sort of come together, but we need to intentionally bring them together. And I know that you, Stuart, and Linnet are key movers and shakers in helping to do that. We're all working on trying to make those 4 areas come together in a coherent way. Here's the 4 areas. 1, IHL, International Humanitarian Law. How does it apply in the age of ICTs? We don't fully know yet. We have a new ICRC review issue out, and kudos to those who contributed, but we need more than that issue. We need a commentary requested by states parties. We're wobbling towards that, that really lays out answers, or the beginning of answers to critical questions. Is there humanitarian cyberspace? Where does humanitarian cyberspace exist? And this goes back to Sentinel, which is what we were missing then is how do we observe or to combat those removed from combat? Were we as Sentinel or to combat? The civilians were, and back to Linnet's reference to DII, demographically identifiable information, it is DII not PII, that is more and more determining whether civilians are targeted and that order to combat, protection, removal from fighting is violated. And we have no clarity on that. The second issue is literally the science of using these technologies, these data flows individually, but most importantly in mosaic or in fusion together. And we've been acting like, well, if you know how to use this one data flow, say call detail records, and you can do that competently and ethically, then that's fine. Well, the operational reality is that we are braiding these ropes together more and more in highly experimental ways. 5 years ago, it may have been about, could you use stream 1? Now it's about, can you use stream 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, forever and ever. And so now the question is, how do we know that we are developing insights that are reliable, that are safe, that are reproducible from fused view analyses? The third issue is, back to the governance question, is that we are, I'm about to start quoting Madonna, we're living in a material world. We're living in a DII world with PII rules. And so we look at the performative data protection functions from GDPR and other elements that are about PII protection with groups where the affected populations, whether we're talking Cox's Bazar, Zottery Camp, et cetera, they understand in a life and death way the implications of their data about them as population. But for
Natty, we've lost your connection momentarily. Can you hear me now? I'm just waiting because it's catching up. We can't hear you though. Linnet, are you still able to hear me?
Yeah, I'm sure we'll get Natty back in a moment.
Yeah, I think it's just catching up. Natty, maybe if you can just toggle off your video and then put it back on, I think that'll help catch up the connection. He'll reconnect. Here we go. There we are. Sorry.
So how do we apply 20th century PII norms to group data? The answer is they just don't work. And the fourth and final thing is really the question of what does liability look like and what should it look like? The big problem here is that because of US law, the internet developed from the 90s with Communications Decency Act, Section 230, with basically blanket indemnification for companies. And now there's a question about whether that should change. We can't sue for harm in many cases here. And so we are developing a duty of care, lowercase d, lowercase c, around ethics. But we're doing that really backwards, where we never had a clear legal capital D, capital C duty of care. So these are the four big areas. And we've been doing them sort of deductively. We need to now do them intentionally and say, okay, these are the areas. Recap: law, science, group protections, and then it comes down to real liability and real application of civil law. Over.
Great, and thanks for that recap, Natty. That helped so that people can really be clear on the quadrants, as you referred to them, and how they come together. We have about 5 minutes left, and we have one question in the chat, which I'll read and then ask you both to just sort of speak to in responding to my final question for you. So the question from Peter Cairns is really whether you can recommend any longer written treatments on the subjects that we've been discussing today. be ready for a list, Peter, because there are certainly both Linnet and Natty's own work, but also broadly in the sector, quite a lot of resources on these topics. And then Peter specifically highlighted the displacement of humanitarian ethics by other elements such as legalistic or regulatory principles, and then the notion of more data or more open data automatically leading to better outcomes in the humanitarian space. So feel free to make some plugs for articles or other references that might be useful. And then a question from Marcella Calabi. So a question or perhaps an observation, but I'll read it and then we can see how to address it. You've pointed to two fundamental truths. So one is the maxim that you can get more done if you don't care who gets the credit, which raises then the problems not only of getting funding, which is something both of you have spoken to, but also convincing policymakers about what works and how. And then two, the gap between the do no harm principle and the reality that rules often fail even when they're intended to prevent harm, which you've also both spoken to. The spirit of the law ultimately has to lead while the letter of the law is revised, which is a really well-observed point. So any farther comment on the relevance of these two truths is essentially what Marcella is inviting. And I will complicate that, but then summarize with my final question. So Nathaniel used the term of sort of weaving these different elements together, and it sounds to me like a Gordian knot. As these different factors become increasingly interdependent, it looks more and more intractable in some ways, but we know that there are techniques for isolating and understanding and then responding to the different issues that arise. So my question is it a Gordian knot, or can we actually cut through some of these issues and make progress on ethical data management in the sector? And just to recap the two questions from the audience, maybe what resources can help us do that? And then to Marcella's point, how might humanitarians be doing that already in terms of balancing these different truths or dynamics that are at play? So a very simple question with about a minute and a half for each of you to respond. So Linnet, over to you first.
Okay, I come to this very much as an outsider. That is my purpose and my position. I study the humanitarian community from without. And what I see is most organizations doing what national governments did only 10 years later, which is lying down voluntarily in front of the train of innovation and welcoming getting run over by it. And I think that the tools to govern this kind of partnership / collaboration are already there much more strongly in the humanitarian community than they are in most other communities dealing with this problem, in that the community has a strong central ethics that is super clear, that is written down in multiple places, and which is frequently discussed in international gatherings and within organizations. And somehow people seem to be stepping away from that judiciously when it comes to tech. And I think that countries are still finding their way back to democratic principles and to first principles with regard to technology partnerships. And the humanitarian community needs to find its way back a little faster. And it's not impossible, but it comes from conversations like this, from resensitizing people to the idea that they are actually in control of more than they think, I think.
Brilliant, Linnet, thanks. That's a really clear call to action for people to also just remember what exists and remember that just because the tools are changing and evolving, the rules do not. They need to adapt, but they fundamentally remain the same in terms of the principles we're working with. Natty, same question, over to you.
Everything I am most proud of in my career related to technology and humanitarianism, the moments that for me, I will always treasure, were the worst for my career. And that's the problem, is that, it means that we're asking individuals still to figure out the rules themselves and to be heroes. And that's not a system of governance. That is a recipe for failure and for catastrophic failure. Now we have come a long way, baby. To quote, I believe it's the cool cigarette ad of the 1970s and 80s. We've come a long way, and a lot because of folks here today on this Zoom. The point is that the getting to a rules-based, non-heroic approach to these issues is about the future of the humanitarian principles and the future of humanitarianism itself. And to underscore what Linnet said, and she's absolutely right, why does humanitarianism need to run back to the principles as it relates to tech? Because it's not just about humanitarianism. If we do this, we provide a phenotype example to the world about how to deal with the integration of group data dilemmas into rights, into law, and also shows operational practices for how to literally listen to communities, include communities, give communities agency and informed notification and informed participation when consent may no longer be the basis of measuring successful realization of rights. In closing, so what are the resources? Well, volume 1 of the Signal Code on rights of populations in crisis related to information activities by humanitarians, in volume 2, lead author, Mr. Stuart Campo, on ethical obligations of humanitarian actors when using ICTs and data. Over.
Thank you, Natty. We'll be sure to share those links in the chat with the group. And thank you both for sharing your experience and insights and for such a candid conversation. I think why we were so happy and thankful to the organizers of your workshop to have this discussion is that too often the discussion stops at the acknowledgement that ethics matter and not really delving into what that actually means. So we would encourage your community to have more grounded discussions about these issues, create space in your organizations to deliberate different ethical issues that are actually arising in your work with data and technology. And to Natty's point, don't make this a heroic individual effort. This should not be an aberration. This should not look like whistleblowing. It should be part of how you make decisions day to day about delivering the best possible analysis and assistance for populations in crisis. So we hope this has been useful to you all. We'll be sure to share additional resources via the platform, whatever it is that you're using. And we look forward to connecting with your community again soon. Linnet and Natty, thank you very much. And I'm sure we will speak about these issues again very quickly. Take care, everybody.